Welcome back to Andersen Acres. We're in the kitchen again. We're just going to talk a little bit today about baking with yeast because yeast can sometimes be a little bit of a mystery. We're going to try and take some of the mystery out of yeast. First of all, yeast is a living organism. Okay? That's why it goes bad. It doesn't go bad, it just is dead. So it's a living organism. So that's why it's important to know that your yeast is still good. So before you even buy a package of yeast, you want to check the expiration. If you're buying jars like this, then the expiration will be on the top. If you're buying envelopes, it's usually on the back. But find your expiration, and if it's past that expiration, it's probably dead. It's one of those few things where if it has a best before date, if you're after that date, you're most likely not going to have an effective yeast. So check the expiration date. The second thing you want to do is if you're not sure, you can test to see if your yeast is alive. So before we do that, there are two types of yeast I'm going to show you here today. This one is a traditional yeast. This is what you use if you're making dough by hand. This one is a quick rise. You can also get a bread machine yeast. They're basically the same. They're very similar. This one's already broken down a little bit. It has an enzyme in it that speeds up the rising process. So which one you use depends on how you're baking your breads. If you're using a bread maker, you're almost always going to use a quick rise or a bread machine yeast simply because it makes the rising happen faster, and in a bread machine where you have timers, you want that to happen on time. You don't necessarily have the luxury of waiting for your traditional yeast to develop. Traditional yeast does give you a fuller flavor, but that's because it does take longer to rise. So when you're using a quick rise or a bread machine, your rising time might be as much as half of what it is if you use a traditional yeast. So you can use either one. It doesn't matter that much, and most people can't tell the difference in the finished product. So use whichever one suits your needs. So testing our yeast. If you're not sure if your yeast is any good, if you think maybe you left the cap off or maybe it has gone bad, you can test it. You can dissolve 1 teaspoon of sugar in a half a cup of warm water. That warm water should not be warmer than about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. You're actually better if you're around 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but 110 max temperature. You might want to use a thermometer to double check that your water's not too hot or too cold. So after you've mixed the sugar into the water, you sprinkle just about 1 teaspoon of yeast onto the top of the water. You can stir it in and set a timer. Check at 5 minutes to see if your yeast has started to dissolve. It should have absorbed enough liquid to activate and kind of start bobbing around a little bit. It should have puffed up just a little bit. After 10 minutes, the yeast should have multiplied, and instead of having only half a cup of liquid, you should have at least 3/4 cups of liquid, maybe even a full cup of liquid, just because of the rising of the yeast. You can take this test, if it worked, if your yeast is active, and use it in baking your bread. No problem, your yeast is active, but use it right away. You can't set it aside, it's already starting. But that's just how you test to make sure your yeasts are still working. So you might want to invest in a decent thermometer because this will help you test the temperatures of your water or test the temperatures of your different milks and your butters and stuff so you're not too hot or too cold. This one is a candy or deep fry thermometer. That works perfectly well. You can actually get a yeast thermometer, but you don't need to. They're more expensive. These are only about $10, these candy deep fry ones. They have gradients. They're multi-purpose. You can use them for making candy, for deep frying. So get something that, this one even has a cover with all the different temperatures. Get something that you can use for more than one thing. Yeast thermometers are very single purpose and they tend to be more expensive. So a candy or deep fry thermometer will serve you well. So you can just test the temperature of your waters or your milks or whatever you're using. So you might want to invest in a decent thermometer just so you can check. So once you have mixed your yeast into your dough, you do want to put your dough in a warm spot to rise. Yeast needs to rise or proof best, and it does it best at temperatures at about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly. You can go plus or minus that. It'll still rise at 75, that's fine. But if you are over 90, it'll have a harder time rising because of the humidity in the air. So Around 80, 85 is a perfect temperature to proof. Cover your bowl with a damp tea towel or plastic wrap. You can put a plastic bag over it, anything to hold that humidity in. You want to place your bowl in somewhere warm. I use my microwave. If I put this inside my microwave, my doughs puff up really, really nice because the microwave is a closed system. It traps the heat, it traps the humidity, and you are going to have a really nice dough. You don't have to do that. You can place it on top of your television after you've covered it because televisions produce a lot of heat. Though these days we all have thin screens, you can't really do that. So you can also turn your oven on to 300 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 minute, just 1 minute, then turn it off. Then put a dish of water underneath on the bottom rack of your oven. And then stick your bowl covered with your damp tea towel in the oven. Then you can let it rise. Do not let the oven heat up for more than a minute, okay? Because it'll be too hot and your dough will get wrecked. But it is an option. It absolutely is an option. So once your dough has risen, depending on the dough, that'll take different amounts of time. 45 minutes, maybe an hour, 90 minutes, depending on what your dough is made of. But once your dough has risen, you can test to see if it's done. So this one has been rising for about an hour and 10 minutes, I guess. Yeah, looking at the time, hour and 10 minutes or so. And we can test to see if this is done. Usually you just go, well, it's doubled in size, and it has, and you just use it. But if you're concerned that it might not be quite ready, you can test by pushing a finger into it. So I'm going to take 2 fingers, and you're only going to poke about half an inch into the dough. You're not going to jam your fingers all the way into there. So you're just going to give it a poke, about half an inch. If those stay, if your pokes stay, then your dough is ready. If the indentations puff out immediately, like these are puffing out, so this probably needs another 10 minutes or so before it's really ready, because these are filling in. If your dough fills in after about 2 minutes, you wait about 2 minutes, and if your finger marks are filling in, then you might want to give your dough just a little more time. This probably needs about another 10 minutes before it's actually ready to shape. So that's just how you check to see if your dough has risen. For the most part, it's not that crucial. If it has been rising for a decent amount of time and it has doubled in size, then you're probably fine to use it. But you can always use the finger poke test just to check. So that's all you really need to know about yeast in order to get some successful yeast breads baking in your kitchen. Tomorrow we are going to probably do a baked potato roll, so join us then. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more of our videos. Bye now.